I think that happened. Should we do something so subtle and so not easy when nobody is in Hong Kong except for the local community? And interestingly, we were all wrong. We were right for 2 weeks, and then it turns out good art would still prevail. Looking back, it was interesting. COVID and not traveling and lockdowns cannot stop collectors from learning and acquiring the good pieces. It's what we've learned.
Welcome to the Artelligence Podcast. Live Art's look behind the scenes at how the global art market really works. I'm your host, Marion Maneker. This podcast is brought to you by Live Art, the global art marketplace that puts you in control. Download the Live Art app to get all of the most relevant art market information, as well as access to exclusive private sales. Or visit us at liveart.io. Jacky Ho is the head of Christie's evening sale in Hong Kong. In this podcast, we talk about the unique position of the Hong Kong sales in the global auction ecosystem. We also talk about his approach to selecting artists and works for those sales, and the interests and ambitions of his clients. I hope you enjoy it. Jacky, thank you for taking the time with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
One of the things I most wanted to start with, there's so many things to talk about with your market and your evening sales, but I've been following these sales for, better part of a decade or more, since the, Chinese contemporary market, as it was called then in the early 2000s, shifted to Hong Kong. And the growth of the paintings market there first emerged as kind of a Pan-Asian market of, major Japanese, Chinese, and Southeast Asian artists. And then there was a switch to a much more global demand for artists. Much of it was meant to be at the top end of artists like Picasso or Richter. But the real traction in the last few years has been for a broad range of global artists of very different types. And I know it's a big question to ask, but I was wondering, how did that happen? Did it just sort of happen organically? Did it happen through some byplay between your experience locally and your experience with a large auction house and personally being in these various cultural locations?
That's indeed a very, very big question. And I don't think it happened overnight, but we have been predicting and seeing it coming. I mean, when I joined the industry sort of a decade ago, it was at the point where it came out from the first dip when so-called the Chinese contemporary market or the Chinese modern market took a dip with the financial crisis. And so people started to buy in a more mature way. I think less speculation, more research, more studying. And they started to also look further than their own market, I think, from that point onward. So I think in general, I'm talking about very general, very broad view of things. I think they started going to museums more. They read more. They look at exhibitions. They go to Venice Biennale. They go to different art events internationally. I think that happened in general in the past 2 decades, I think. So there's less speculation. I think there's more research and there's more collecting in general. I think Asia learned very quickly in the past decade. From my interaction with all the collectors and even with galleries, I think the market went from, just collecting everything without knowing the sort of supply and demand or the importance to a very research-focused market. So I think that happened. And then secondly, I think Art Basel happened. And I think that gave the Asian audience a different perspective. And so the auction market always sort of reflects what's happening in the market. So I think then slowly a few years from Art Basel, and also opening of many new museums in Asia in the past 5 years in Shanghai, and now in Hong Kong with M+, in Southeast Asia, Korea and Japan. And I think that also gave everybody a different perspective. And so that gave the whole movement is then reflected in the auction business, where the secondary market also follows.
But the secondary market, that's very interesting, but I think it also doesn't fully give credit to the fact that the truly global art market right now is in Hong Kong, right? There are sophisticated, very distinctive Asian painters who mostly trade there. And then there are African diaspora painters. And then there are new discoveries. So there's a layering that you don't necessarily see in other markets. The market in Paris will sell different sort of things. And there was a time when Jean-Michel Basquiat was mostly sold in Paris. I mean, that was a long time ago, but there was a time. But they have their distinctively continental artists that trade there. In Hong Kong, it seems we have, lots of different artists. I mean, just off the top of my head, one thinks of George Condo and Eddie Martinez, and even to some extent Cecily Brown, who a lot of their market strength comes from the demand out of the sales in Hong Kong and broadly through Asia.
Right. I think one thing that also changed from previous time is that when Hong Kong was so known to be trading just to start with Chinese artists, and then it became a sales center for all the Asian artists. That took sort of 10 years. What the general public or the art community in the past don't know is that actually some of the transactions that happen outside of Asia or outside of Hong Kong, there's actually quite a big following to start with in the Asian community. So the things that you see all these auction records in New York, in London, and Paris. Only if you work in an auction house, you realize, hang on 1 minute, like actually these are really popular. Like the winner and the underbidders are Asian collectors. Why are we not auctioning them in Hong Kong? So I think that started to change when Hong Kong became more and more international. And when one work finally sells in Hong Kong, and you mentioned George Condo, the current record is in Hong Kong. When the first George Condo was transacted in Hong Kong, people were shocked. They were like, why would you sell a George Condo here? This is an American market. And now we have requests that people only want to sell their George Condo in Hong Kong. So I think that's the fun part of working in auction house. You get to really see a lot of behind the scenes secret. And in the past, everybody go to New York to transact, right? And then and that's the joy of selling and auctioning in New York, because you get bidders from Europe, you get bidders from Asia, and you have American bidders. And the same thing is happening now in Hong Kong. And I think part of the excitement is that we didn't expect that to happen so quickly. Therefore, we're a little bit shocked, but then we're trying to get used to it at the same time.
I agree that it didn't seem to be something you thought was going to happen so quickly, and yet it happened over time. So it's not like we can just say, oh, it's a product of the pandemic. And, clearly one aspect of this is with the whole world shut down, there's been a flattening, and now there's the auction calendar. It isn't really geographic so much as it is time-based. And with that flattening, people can bid on things in Hong Kong because those sales are taking place in between other sales. But you still have to market to people locally. You still sell primarily through relationships, right? I mean, a lot of what you do is talk to collectors and gauge their interest, but also help them through the process and all. So it can't just be a pandemic thing, but it clearly is been, I guess, accelerated by all of that.
Definitely. I remember in the past when I go help out and be a guest of the London sale, for example, one of the biggest challenges is to ask Asian collectors to stay up until 2:30 a.m. to participate in an auction. And so what the pandemic has brought to us is that none of us can come to London now. And so therefore, we have a Hong Kong phone desk. And as a result, our London evening sale actually happens during the day in London, so that it makes sense for New York, for Hong Kong, and also for London. So that's something that I'm very proud of that Christie is doing. So no matter what, like London, New York, and Hong Kong sale, we always do it at the timing that makes sense. That's something that only began during the pandemic. And I wonder how everlasting this could be. It could be a trend that all the London auctions would be, the evening sale at least, would be happening during the day, so that it's truly a global auction, so that it's not an auction where 1/3 of the world is actually in bed.
Yes,
you would have to struggle to stay awake. I mean, you don't want an evening sale where 1/3 of the world is sleeping, right? So, so that started to change, and I think that now you see our London sale. It's truly very, very global as well.
So let's talk a little bit about some of those Pan-Asian artists, because they seem to be, driving the global market, but also a lot of the sales in Hong Kong. And I'm thinking of Kusama as sort of one of the main drivers. And I know you have sold a lot of her work, and I believe you mentioned to someone recently that the pandemic had shifted some of the activity from the more subtle infinity net paintings that require really people to be in front of them to the more graphic pumpkins and all. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the taste is and how the collectors what they're looking for.
Right. So I think it's always a process. So they always shift left, and then suddenly they get overcorrected to the right. So I think, yes, in the beginning of the pandemic, I think when we all in lockdowns and people panic, there's some distress deals, and then people are getting used to buying online. People are used to, or more people are now used to buying purely from your phone and PDF and computers and all these sort of computer generated in scale photos to give you an idea. So I think in the beginning, yes, I think indeed people didn't quite know how to handle a white knight Kusama or something more quiet, something that usually requires an in-person experience to understand, to more figurative, colorful things that actually can translate into your computer monitor. So I think that happened. So I remember 2 years ago in our auctions, we were all asking ourselves, should we do something so subtle and so not easy when nobody is in Hong Kong except for the local community? And interestingly, we were all wrong. We were right for 2 weeks, and then it turns out good art would still prevail. And so there's not really, it is very hard to predict what's going to happen at that moment. And looking back, it was interesting because since then, we've sold some really amazing white infinity net. We've done an auction record of miracles in Hong Kong. We had I think we had a top record of Richard Lin that came out of the Documenta, a very historical piece that.
Yes, and he's a very subtle artist.
Exactly. So I think COVID and not traveling and lockdowns cannot stop collectors from learning and acquiring the good pieces. It's what we've learned.
So let me follow along with that, because Richard Lin's a very interesting case. He's an Anglo-Taiwanese, or I guess just a broadly Anglo-Chinese artist, and a historical one. But you've also got, I'm assuming your collectors own Kusama, they probably also own a Nara or want to. But what artists do those works sit side by side with? And I guess the point I'm asking about is that, those artists are now viewed as global artists. They have a broad base of collectors in North America and Asia. I'm assuming in Europe as well, and all. And so I'm trying to get a sense of how what the broad array of artists is that collectors would choose from, or maybe it's all the same list that the rest of the world does. Is it I own a Nara and I own a Kusama, and then I'm interested in Richard Lynn because he's lesser known, and I think historical artists that more important people will think is important.
I think what people look for these days are. There's so many different type of collectors. There's not one formula that we can generally describe all of them. But I think some common elements are how international are the artists, regardless of their nationalities. I think in general, the trend is that people want to collect something that sells in Europe, in America, and in Asia. So if it's a very regional artist, I think that's reflected in the prices too. Like the collecting community is more narrow. I think that also then discourage people from collecting. When it gets to the multi-million dollars painting, a lot of questions that I get asked is, where's the market? Is it just 5 people in the region? Or is this something that you fight your London and your New York dear colleagues to say, can I please put it in Hong Kong? And your New York colleagues say, can I please put it in New York? Like, for example, a Nara comes up, we all discuss internally, like, can I please put it here? So things like that does affect a collector's decision these days, more and more so. That's why in Hong Kong, you see such an interesting mix, from Picasso to Brothel, from Kusama to Nara, from Nicholas Party to George Condo. A lot of times things that transact in Hong Kong, I would say, are works by artists that can sell anywhere else in the world. Of course, you always have some different combination that some artists only sell in Europe and Hong Kong and Asia. And then some artists only sell in America and Hong Kong. And then you also have some that probably only works in London and New York, but never Hong Kong. So there's different combination, and I think each of the location would always want to reflect a portion of your sort of local taste, and then you have a portion that reflect the international taste. You want, in Hong Kong, we welcome American collectors to bid and compete in the Hong Kong sale room. Sometimes, we see Americans versus America in Hong Kong, and the Asian would not win.
Right.
And the reverse would happen. We've seen things where we send from Asia to a New York evening sale, and then the top 3 collectors are all Asian, and the painting comes back. And that's the fun part of it, is to play with the unpredictable and also expect the predictable things to happen.
So all of that reminds me this idea that there are colorful artists who are important locally, but then become interesting globally, in part because they get representation from galleries and all. Reminds me of a sale I believe you were involved with, which is the, I think it's 7 or 8 panel work by Huang Yuxing that sold for $7 or $8 million, so some large multiple of his previous record price, and even the $1 million mark came fairly soon before or recently from that. And so I was sort of curious to hear, is it just that was one exceptional work, or is it just, a reflection of the development of his market? And if so, could you talk a little bit about the development of his market? So
I think that was a very shocking and yet encouraging result. It was shocking because it was lot 2, I remember. So the evening just began and we have 70 works to go. So everybody is wondering what time we're going to be having our dinner that night. And then, of course, it got to a very, very high level. But at the same time, that was such a unique painting that I think no collectors, no art circle, or current followers of Huang Yuxing's market have ever seen. And I think when that painting went on to the exhibition for the first time, we had a highlight exhibition. I remember people who didn't want to collect Huang Yuxing were looking at it. People who didn't know who Huang Yuxing is came in and said, "How do I bid for this? I like the painting," and started asking about the artist. And then obviously people who already knew about the artist were asking about it. And we were also approached by collectors of other areas who just never look at contemporary art. And they started looking at the evening sale because of this painting. So I think that's the power of art. Sometimes, you don't have to write an essay. You don't have to explain about the painting or the artist. Purely the image attracts people, and it speaks their culture, it speaks the language, and it intrigues them. And a lot of collectors, I think one thing in common is that they're always hungry to learn new things. And I think that gave that spark for a lot of collectors to come and look at the work. And everybody constantly asks, I think at least 20 people ask us, like how much should I be prepared to go? I don't want to lose. At the end, we couldn't answer them. We just come and do your best shot, do what you can afford, be prepared. Like, we don't know. I think there will be 25 telephones. So that's the fun part, that a lot of the things we can't explain. So we look forward to seeing what happens this spring.
I assume that also means there will be more of his works coming to sale. I mean, there have been on the market previous to this, but you and your peers, I'm sure, are actively looking for more work.
At the moment, we're focusing on our Shanghai London sale next week, and we will have our Huang Yuxing in the evening sale there. It's the inauguration auction of our new Shanghai headquarters. So it's two cities joint sale together, a big evening. So we look forward to seeing how that would perform. I think that would be a good indication to the market. You had an amazing, exceptional piece, and what happens to everything else. So I can't really predict what's going to happen, but then maybe we can follow up and see what happens next week.
A week after this interview was recorded, Wang's work, Mandala Reality, was sold in Shanghai for $800,000. That's his fourth highest auction price. Tell me a little bit about how you put your evening sales together, and where, I guess I don't want you to predict where it's going, but sort of where you see interest these days. I mean, I could keep listing all sorts of interesting artists who've either become important in your market, or your market is the important driver of, when I think of, what happened with Dana Schutz and all, and just more and more artist markets seem to be, if not breaking entirely in Hong Kong, at least are reaching an inflection point. It feels like the Javier Calleja market really broke through in Hong Kong sales. So I'm sort of curious about what you're looking for or thinking about in the coming months.
So when we put an evening sale together, obviously we have around 60 to 80 seats. We hope to bring the best pictures in every sort of category or nationality. To be honest, my job daily is I reject so many things. I have to be the bad guy to say, no, I'm so sorry, this cannot be in the evening sale. That's sort of my daily job. Every day I have to tell people, or colleagues and friends and clients, that no, we can't offer evenings. I'm so sorry. Can you please don't hate me? And then I offer my logic. I think the logic of the evening sale, at least in Hong Kong, is that we have to show something that is different from London and New York, obviously. So we have a certain seat that it's not like we reserve for the Asian artists, but then there are certain things that we need to remain. For example, we'll always have a Zhao almost, or I lose my job. We always have a Sanyu. We have our Kusama, we have our Nara. I can't just do a sale with 20 Nicholas Party. I can't just have another 25 George Condo after the auction record. So I think it's one keyword is probably diversity, and then another keyword is probably quality, because our audience is not just the Asian collectors, but it's also the European and also the American collectors. In the last time when I was able to travel just before COVID, I think 2 years ago, I remember very clearly meeting with a Western collector, and they tell us that look, we only look for this series in this period in this artist, and we're like, oh, that's wonderful, because that's exactly the opposite of what the Asian collectors would look for. They actually want this period and also this subject instead. And they're like, oh, that's how very interesting. In that case, would you mind hunting one for me as well, just in case? Like, I would like to peg against my taste and interest, and also collect what the Asians are collecting. So I think things like that are always the most interesting, because I remember, when I started my career, I think we always get asked, what is America, what is New York collecting right now? And then they sort of follow. And now we're seeing that both sides are influencing each other.
And I think you mentioned it earlier, and it's worth coming back to, since ultimately the value of art is what the next person will pay for it. It's important, if you're concerned with something maintaining or increasing in value, that there be more collectors coming in behind. And so it is, essential to understand that there's interest, and knowing that there's depth of interest in Asia, where there's been a great deal of growth, would be obviously the smart way of looking at a work. And even if you are, choosing within that band, there's still usually with artists a fair amount of choice of price and subject matter and work to choose from, and it certainly seems like the smart collectors are making sure that obviously taste can change, and you can't predict what will happen in 3 or 5 years or 20 years, but you can at least think in terms of who's out there, and it clearly makes sense to play within the field where there are going to be other buyers.
Exactly, and sometimes it's even hard to predict what's happening next season.
Yeah.
Let alone 2 years later. So yeah, I think now it's really busy. When you're a collector, you really have to constantly absorb new things. And there's always an auction every week. There's always an art fair, and sort of just the art news alone can take you 30 minutes, an hour each day, and you have a day job. And therefore you are capable of collecting. So there's a huge amount of information to digest, I think, as a collector these days.
So you mentioned, and this is probably sort of the logical place to end, but you mentioned Zawuki and Sanyu. Sanyu especially has a bit of a longer market history than Zhao, but Zhao has a much larger body of work, and there's been a process over the last 10 or 15 years of essentially importing the work that was in Europe, because Zhao lived in a long life in France and all. It feels like that process is mostly over, and maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe there still is work moving from Europe to Asia, but he sometimes sort of thought of in market terms as the person who fills the same role as Picasso does in the Impressionist and modern market, just because there is so much work and so much of it is valuable. And as you sort of pointed out earlier, everyone feels that they need to own one. Does that work with also these other artists we've been talking about? Does someone own a Zhao and a cause? I'm trying to think of something sort of wildly different, or a Zhao and a Kusama, or is it like a specific sort of collector, the way we think of Impressionists and modern collectors having a fairly specific taste?
I think that's a really interesting and fun question to sort of close and conclude. And that's exactly why Christie has merged the Impressionist and also the contemporary department into one 20th and 21st century team, like very big global team. And honestly, that really makes sense because there's not so much difference actually. As I mentioned just now, people want to collect what echoes their culture. So obviously, Asian collectors would always have a certain sort of reserved seats for Asian artists because there's something that in a cause or in a Warhol you don't get. It's the same thing, right? European collectors would collect European artists because there's something that you can't find from a Kusama. And so, yes, I think people do collect Banksy, they collect KAWS, they collect Huang Yuxin, and at the same time they have a Picasso, they have an ink painting at home by Zhang Daqian. I think people want diversification, and I think people want blue chip, and people want new excitement. So, KAWS collectors, they're not just purely people in their 20s or 30s. They're very senior collectors who look at KAWS in Asia. And I think Asian collectors are very open-minded. So they learn really quickly, I think, in general. So they're very open to new things. And when it comes to things that they don't understand, I think that triggers them to be more intrigued, and because they don't understand. But then they're seeing that the world is reacting. They also want to ask themselves, like, is it about taste or is it just me not keeping up with the world? So that's the fun part to work in a big auction house in Asia, is that you get a very macro view of the art market.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the point, isn't it? Is that the Hong Kong has become this best place to gauge the market in terms of sort of broad and emerging taste, and still seeing that people who clearly do their homework, and I think you put it perfectly, learn very quickly. We've seen that just in the short period of time that this market has been growing, that it's a sophisticated market. Nobody thinks that you can just take stuff that didn't sell in America or Europe and sell it in Asia. And I guess if anyone has tried, they've learned it doesn't work too easily.
They've probably learned it the hard way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Infantry sales doesn't work in Asia. People say, I've seen that.
Yeah, and so it feels like it's the exact opposite. We're now looking to the Asian sales for the kinds of interesting market knowledge and indicators of the things that will become important globally as time goes on. So they're sort of the world's leading day sales in the sense of, you see all of this work in the day sales, and you can see a lot of movement, and it gives you some, indicators of where taste is heading.
Indeed. Talking about day sale, one last note is that I think when we put together an auction, no matter evening or day sale, when collectors from a different time zone really stay up or wake up early to participate in the auction, I think that is our mission, is that we're offering something so different, so good, that, I think last day sale, someone at a ridiculous time zone participated in our day sale, and I was on the phone with them and was, thanking them, and they're like, thank you, I have not seen something like this in an auction, and this is exactly what's missing in my collection. And that's our mission in here, in no matter day sale or evening. So we hope to look for good things that intrigues everyone.
Well, that's a perfect place to stop. Thank you so much, Jacky. This has been an education, but also really enjoyable.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure's mine.
Thank you for joining us at the Artelligence Podcast, edited by Colin Ketchen, who also composed the original music. For more episodes, listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to download the LiveArt app or visit us at liveart.io. Please join us for the next episode of the Artelligence Podcast. We're looking forward to it.